Hey everyone, have you ever said yes when every fiber of your being wanted to say no? Have you ever smiled through exhaustion, agreed when you disagreed, or apologized for something that wasn't your fault just to keep the peace? If you're nodding right now, so am I, and you're not alone. More importantly, you're not broken. Welcome to Pulling Threads, Weaving Authenticity. I'm Leslie, and today we're pulling a thread on something that millions of women carry invisibly and what some call a mask of imperfection or good girl syndrome. This is a silent epidemic of people pleasing, the exhausting performance of being nice, being agreeable, always putting others first. And here's what we're going to explore today: where this pattern comes from, what it's actually doing to your nervous system, and why understanding the neuroscience behind it is a first step toward setting yourself free. So take a deep breath. This conversation might feel uncomfortable, but I promise you there's a liberation in naming those things that have been unnamed. So, what is good girl syndrome? Some of us like being called good girl, but not in this way. Good girl syndrome is not a clinical diagnosis. You won't find it in the DSM-5, but it is a very real pattern of behavior and belief that shapes how millions of women move through the world. Many of us move through the world this way and don't even realize that it's causing harm. At its core, good girl syndrome is the unconscious belief that your worth is wrapped up or contingent on being pleasing and helpful and non-threatening to others, making other people feel comfortable. It's the internalized rule book that says, don't be loud, don't take up too much space, don't have needs that might inconvenience others, be nice, even at your own expense. Your anger is probably unacceptable. Your desires are totally selfish, and boundaries are mean. Now, here's where neuroscience gets kind of interesting and oftentimes validating. Dr. Harriet Braker, a clinical psychologist, wrote extensively on people pleasing and identified what she called the disease to please. But recent neuroscience research shows us it isn't a character flaw, it's a survival mechanism that quickly becomes hardwired into our brains before we're old enough to understand what's happening. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Social, Cognitive, and Affective Neuroscience used functional MRI imaging to study people pleasers' brains. And what they found was striking. When people pleasers were faced with the possibility of disappointing somebody, their amygdala, which is the brain's fear center, lit up like a Christmas tree. For these individuals, saying no or setting a boundary triggered the same neural fear response as a physical threat. Let me say that again. Your brain interprets disappointing someone as dangerous. And this isn't a weakness. This is what your nervous system is doing, what it was trained to do, long before you understood what was happening or had any control over this. So don't start blaming yourself. That's what people pleasers do. We're not doing that, all right? So how did we get here? How does a little girl become a woman who can't say no without drowning in guilt? The answer lies in what psychologists call conditional love or socialization. From the moment we're born, we're learning what behaviors keep us safe, connected, and loved. And for many of us, especially those of us or those who are raised as girls, we learned very early that certain behaviors were rewarded and others were punished. Dr. Rachel Simmons, author of Odd Girl Out, has documented how girls as young as 4 years old begin to suppress their authentic expressions of anger and disagreement because they've already learned that those emotions threaten relationships. And for a child, losing connections with caregivers is literally a survival threat. It really is. Here's the developmental psychology. Children have what's called external locus of control. This means their sense of safety and worth comes from outside themselves, from their parents' approval, their teachers' praise, and their peers' acceptance. Psychologist Dr. Tara Brach explains this as the development of what she calls the trance of unworthiness. If a child's authentic self, their anger, needs, boundaries, and big feelings is consistently met with disapproval, withdrawal, or punishment, they learn to abandon that authentic self in favor of a false self that's more acceptable. The neuroscience backs this up. Dr. Dan Siegel's research on attachment and the developing brain shows that repeated experiences of good behavior equaling love and safety literally wire neural pathways. By the time we're adults, the pattern is so automatic we don't even realize that we're doing it. But here's the gendered piece that we can't ignore. This conditioning happens differently for girls than most boys. There's a landmark study from Harvard University's Making Caring Common project that surveyed over 20,000 youths and found that girls received significantly more messages about being nice and caring for others, while boys received more messages about being strong and independent. Sociologist Krista Spears' research shows that by age 5, girls have already internalized the message that they should be helpful, not be bossy, even though the same behavior is often called leadership in boys. They should put others' comfort before their own, manage other people's emotions, and apologize more frequently. These aren't natural biological differences, even though we kind of thought that they were. These are learned patterns of survival in a world that rewards female compliance. And here's the painful truth. For many of us, being the good girl worked. Definitely did for me. Kept us safe. It earned us praise. It helped us avoid conflict. It made us feel valuable and accepted. It made us feel like we belonged. Until it didn't. And that's where the problem lies. As we get older, being the good girl becomes much more dangerous for us. But first, let's talk about what this pattern actually costs us. Not in abstract terms, but in your actual lived daily experience. Okay? I'm talking about the nervous system toll. First, the neuroscience of chronic abandonment tells us a lot. When you consistently override your authentic needs, feelings, boundaries, you're creating what's called chronic physiological stress. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, world-famous trauma researcher and author of The Body Keeps Score, explains that when we can't express authentic emotion and set boundaries, that energy doesn't just disappear. It gets trapped in our bodies. Research from the University of Texas found that chronic people-pleasing is correlated with a lot of things we don't want, like high cortisol levels. That's your stress hormone. Disrupted sleep patterns, weakened immune function, higher rates of anxiety and depression. Think about it physiologically. Every time you say yes when you mean no, your body experiences a micro betrayal. Your nervous system knows the truth, even when your mouth is saying something different. Polyvagal theory tells us that your vagus nerve, the major nerve connecting your brain and your body, is constantly reading cues of safety and danger. When you consistently abandon yourself to please others, you're teaching your nervous system that you are not a safe person for you to be around. Think about that. The result is chronic activation of your sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response, even in everyday situations. Everyday situations putting you and your body into fight or flight. What does this lead to? Emotional exhaustion. This is the sheer emotional labor taking a toll. There's another term called emotional labor to describe the work of managing emotions, both your own and others, as part of a job. But for those of us with good girl syndrome, emotional labor isn't just work. It's every relationship, every interaction, every single day. You're constantly reading the room, feeling the need to manage other people's emotions and suppressing your own needs, performing agreeability at all costs, anticipating what others want, often apologizing for your very existence. Research published in Sex Roles Journal found that women perform significantly more emotional labor in relationships than men. And this disparity is linked to higher rates of burnout and resentment. And here's the insidious part. You might not even realize how exhausted you are because exhaustion is your baseline now. Perhaps the deepest cost is when you've spent possibly decades being who others need you to be, and you lose track of who you actually are. I had no idea I was lost, but one day I realized I don't know who I am anymore. I definitely don't like who I am, but it took a tremendous amount of work to uncover how I got there. Psychologist Harriet Lerner describes this as de-selfing, the gradual erosion of your authentic self in service of maintaining relationships. This is in part why Pulling Threads podcast was created. Pulling threads, unprogramming all of these things we're talking about in this episode. So ask yourself, what do you actually like to do? Not what are you supposed to do? What do you like to do? What are you actually angry about? Not what's acceptable to be angry about. What do you actually want? Not what would make you seem selfish. If you're drawing a blank, you're experiencing what psychologists call self-concept confusion. A study found that chronic people pleasers score significantly lower on measures of self-clarity. They genuinely don't know who they are outside of their role as helper, peacemaker, accommodator. They're lost. And here's the cruelest irony. The very behavior we use to maintain relationships actually prevents genuine, real intimacy for us. Dr. Brené Brown's research on vulnerability and connection shows that authentic relationships require what she calls clear is kind. The willingness to be honest about your needs and boundaries, even when it's uncomfortable. When you're performing perfection, people aren't connecting with you. They're connecting with your mask. You're surrounded by people, but utterly alone because no one knows who you really are. I remember times when the things that were coming out of my mouth and the things I was doing did not match the thoughts I was having in my head. So you might wonder, what if I stop being a good girl? Won't people leave? And that's the fear. That's what keeps us in the good girl role. And it's valid. Some people will leave. The people who benefited from your self-abandonment might not like the authentic version of you. I certainly experienced this as I passed through my journey to myself. But here's the truth. Research supports that healthy relationships don't require you to abandon yourself. In fact, Dr. John Gottman, who is the world leader on relationship research, shows that the healthiest relationships are built on what he calls bidirectional influence, where both people's needs matter equally. And that's what to be looking for. Once we realize that we are suffering from good girl syndrome, we might lose people who benefited from it. But we will quickly find people who love us and want to be around us for who we actually are. So if you're recognizing yourself in this, first, welcome to awareness. This is actually the hardest step and the bravest one. Neuroscience shows us that awareness itself begins to change the brain immediately. You have to name it to tame it, according to Dr. Siegel. When we can identify and name a pattern, we activate the prefrontal cortex, which helps us regulate that amygdala fear response. So just by listening to this episode, by recognizing, oh, this is me, you're already starting to loosen the pattern's grip. Here are some signs that you might be living behind the mask of perfection. Let's start with physical signs. Chronic tension in your jaw, shoulders, or stomach. Difficulty falling or staying asleep. Getting sick more often. Feeling constantly tired even after rest. Here's some emotional signs. Feeling resentful but not expressing it. Having difficulty identifying what you actually feel. Apologizing constantly, even for things that aren't your fault. Feeling like you're performing rather than being. Here are some behavioral signs. Saying yes immediately before checking in with yourself. My God, I totally do that. Over-explaining or justifying your decisions. Avoiding conflict at all costs. Taking responsibility for other people's emotions. Struggling to ask for help. Here are some relationship signs. People expect you to always be available. You attract people who take more than they give. Feeling invisible in your own relationships. Wondering if people would like you if they really knew you. The therapeutic term for beginning to see these patterns is de-identification. You start to recognize, oh, I'm doing that thing again. This is a good girl pattern, not the authentic me. This creates what neuroscientists call a response flexibility window, that tiny moment between stimulus and response where choice becomes possible because you've paused long enough to tell yourself that you are not in danger. Okay? I want to be clear. Undoing decades of conditioning does not happen overnight. And it may be this particular thing, maybe something that we all work on for the rest of our lives. This isn't about suddenly becoming someone who doesn't care about others. It's about expanding your circle of care to finally including yourself. Research on self-compassion shows that the antidote to good girl syndrome is not selfishness, it's self-compassion. It's treating yourself with the same kindness you offer everyone else. So here are some neuroscience-backed starting points. Practice the pause. This single-handedly changed my life. Before automatically saying yes, practice saying, let me check my schedule and get back to you. This creates that response flexibility window. Even a 30-second pause allows your prefrontal cortex to come online and ask, what do I actually want here? Okay? Start tracking your yeses. For 1 week, write down every time you say yes to something. Then mark which ones were authentic yeses and which ones were people-pleasing yeses. Don't judge yourself. You're just collecting data. Because remember, awareness is the first step. Experiment with micro boundaries. You don't have to set massive boundaries right away. Start small. Order what you actually want at a restaurant. Say, actually, I'm not available then, once. Notice what happens in your body when you do. Your nervous system needs to learn that boundary setting isn't dangerous, but give it time. Research shows that change happens in relationship. So find a therapist, a coach, or a community of women who are also unlearning these patterns. You need mirrors who reflect back your authentic self, not your performing self. Reconnect with your body. Your body knows the truth before your mind does. So practices like somatic therapy, yoga, even just placing your hand on your heart, which I do all the time, and asking, what do I need right now? Helps rebuild the connection between your authentic self and your lived experience. I literally do this like 20 times a day. Okay? It's a work in progress, even for those of us who are helping others with this work. Here's what I want you to know. You're not difficult, demanding, or selfish for wanting to be known as you actually are. You're not ungrateful for recognizing the cost of the mask of perfection. You're waking up. And that's the bravest thing you can do. The good girl kept you safe. She deserves your gratitude, not your shame. But she doesn't have to run your life anymore. Authenticity isn't about being perfect at being imperfect. It's about ongoing practice of choosing yourself even when it feels uncomfortable, even when you're afraid, even when you don't do it perfectly. You deserve to take up space. You deserve to have needs. You deserve to be loved, not for what you do, but for who you are. That's the thread we're pulling. And on the other side is freedom. Thank you for being here. Until next time, keep pulling threads and keep weaving authenticity. I see you.